What's up, Tailgaters? My name is Tailgate Nate, and welcome to my channel. Again, sorry for not posting this video earlier. I was busy on like a little vacation, if you will. Again, I was in Kansas, watched the Kansas game. Just didn't really have time to do any YouTube stuff, but now I'm back. And today, I'm going to be talking about my new and updated top 25 for this week. We had a lot of upsets last week. A couple top 10 teams went down. A couple teams in the lower rankings lost some teams in the upper rankings. There's a lot of shuffling and movement and some new teams to the fray this week. So you guys are going to find out who that is in a little bit. But first, I appreciate you guys clicking on this video and helping support the channel. Other ways you can do that are like, comment, subscribe, anything like that. It does help support my channel. It does really mean a lot to me. So there's a lot of shuffling in this poll. But as usual, first off, we got to talk about the honorable mentions to this list. And again, there are quite a bit of them. So a couple teams out of the SEC, LSU and Florida, who ended up dropping out of this poll. Florida lost to a pretty good Tennessee team. And now you might start to be wondering, is that week one performance against Utah just kind of a fluky performance? Are we going to see that again from Florida this year? And I think at some point down the road, we may end up seeing that from Florida again. But as of right now, Florida's going to have to sit here as an honorable mention. Same thing with LSU. LSU's beating a good Mississippi State team, and they got a lot of tougher games down the road on their schedule, so we'll find out how good this LSU team really is. A couple teams here from the Sun Belt or the Fun Belt. Coastal Carolina is rolling. They're undefeated. They're looking really good right now. And James Madison, how about that comeback win against the Appalachian State Mountaineers? App State's had a crazy season, and James Madison, in their first year as an FBS program, they're doing really, really well. Sad that they can't make a bowl game this year because that's kind of looking like where it's trending for JMU. You got a couple teams out of the Big 12 on here in Texas who fell out of the poll, and Texas Tech, who beat Texas last week. Also Kansas State, who pulled off a massive upset against Oklahoma. I know a lot of people have K-State ranked. The only reason I don't have K-State ranked is I want to see kind of what Kansas State is still capable of, right? I still have some questions about that team. That was a good one-off performance. Let's see if they can sustain that in the weeks to come. A couple teams out of the ACC here. You got Syracuse and North Carolina that are very close to breaking into the poll. North Carolina kind of falls a little bit after that loss from last week, but that was a Notre Dame team that really started to find their offense last week, and Notre Dame is an honorable mention on this list there as well. And then Syracuse, of course, going 4-0. They're off to a real flying start. Of course, you have Cincinnati, who, with Houston struggling, Cincinnati may very well be that best group of five team yet again. So they could be looking to make their way into a New Year's Six spot in a bowl game. And then a couple teams at the bottom of your screen out of the Pac-12. And you got the Oregon State Beavers and the UCLA Bruins. Oregon State gave USC a run for their money last week. I absolutely consider them for this poll. And UCLA, again, has had some shaky performances, but overall, still without a loss. One of the few teams left in FBS without a loss. So UCLA got some recognition, and I thought about it, whether or not to put them in this poll, but I ended up not doing it. So who did make my top 25? We're going to start out with 25. Go to number 1 as per usual, and 25 and 24 are new teams to the fray, and that's Florida State and Kansas. Yes, Kansas. Okay, let's talk about Florida State first. They've played some really good, they've played some pretty solid teams up to this point, but in my opinion, they haven't really played a super good team quite yet, and that's going to change down the line. They have Wake Forest coming up this week, and that is going to be a huge game for both Florida State and Wake Forest. Wake Forest did actually rise a spot after that overtime game against Clemson. So Wake Forest and Florida State, that's a big game. That's a huge game coming up this week for both of those teams. Florida State, of course, to stay unbeaten and prove that Florida State football is back and they're rolling. And Wake Forest to prove that Clemson game was not a fluke last week and that they can play like that every other week. Then again, Wake Forest defense does need to get better from last week. Excuse me, guys. That's a Clemson offense that has been pretty stagnant the past couple of years, and they scored 51 on Wake Forest, and Clemson scoring 51, not necessarily the biggest thing, but Wake Forest allowing 51 points, that's noteworthy. That's to be taken note of. Of course, they lost their defensive coordinator, and still maybe trying to find that rhythm without him. So Wake Forest, Florida State, that's going to be a great matchup next week. Wake Forest rises a spot as Florida State is there at number 25. And 24 is Kansas. I got the pleasure of watching Kansas in person this past weekend. And Jalen Daniels is something else. He has the highest QBR right now in Power 5. Or actually in all of the nation has the highest QBR. I believe I saw 98.6 QBR. Now, take it for granted, Kansas is like a read option type offense. They love to run the read option stuff. And Kansas, I thought, played well against Duke. One thing that I noticed, especially being able to watch Kansas in person, defending outside of those hash marks is troubling for the Jayhawks. So they have Iowa State this week, TCU next week, but when they go play some teams like Baylor and Oklahoma State that can really spread the field on you offensively, Kansas is going to have a tougher time playing those teams there. Pitt is at number 23. They dropped 2 spots from last week. Starting to get a little more concerned about this Pittsburgh team, but they keep winning games that they should win. And Pitt, this is primarily a case of just other teams jumping ahead of them in the rankings. So that is exactly why Pitt fell to 23. And they're going to have some tougher games on the schedule coming up here as well. So keep an eye on Pitt. They're going to get back in the fray here fairly soon. So we'll kind of see what Pittsburgh can do. Also of note, Miami did drop out of this poll after their upset loss to Middle Tennessee State. And yeah, again, they were not on my honorable mention list. They got some stuff to work out for sure. I've already talked a little bit about Wake Forest, but they jump a spot after narrowly beating Clemson. They needed overtime, and they just couldn't get it done. And then Washington is up here, 4-0. The Huskies at number 21. They jump up a spot there as well. They were able to beat Stanford this past weekend. And Washington is a good team, especially if Michael Penix, if he can stay healthy. They're going to be getting a couple pieces on this defense back later in the year as they've been out with injury. So Washington's only got up to go, and this can turn into a real contender in the Pac-12. So there's 25 through 21. Let's jump ahead now into the top 20 where I have another new face of the poll, Minnesota. And I got to be honest when I say I don't know how I haven't ranked Minnesota earlier. I'm going to be flat honest and say I don't know how Minnesota has stuck as an honorable mention and not been into the top 25, because especially after being able to watch that Michigan State game this past weekend, wow. Minnesota is for real. They're legit, and this is a good, balanced Minnesota team. Yes, they have lost a weapon. Chris Autman-Bell, I believe, is out for the year. But Minnesota proved last week that they don't necessarily need his play. Now, he's definitely the best wide receiver on that group, and some of these other wide receivers are going to have to take a step up. But Mo Ibrahim is running all over the country. I believe he's the leader in rushing yards this year so far. Tanner Morgan has had a resurgence. And, getting that old offensive coordinator back and Kirk Soraka worked out really well for Minnesota, and it's working this year. So Minnesota right now, in my mind, clearly looks like the best team in the Big Ten West. Looks like the prime favorite to go to Indianapolis. They avoid playing Ohio State on their regular season schedule. So we'll see what happens with Minnesota this year, but there's a lot of good things coming from Minnesota right now. Ole Miss stayed where they're at. They had some troubles with Tulsa this past week. They were able to go ahead and get away with a win, and the AP poll jumped them into the top 15. Now, I see that with all the upsets and everything, but I'm still a little skeptical about this Ole Miss team. But we're going to find out a lot about Ole Miss when they play Kentucky this week. That is a huge matchup. That's a huge matchup. So Ole Miss going to play Kentucky this week. We'll find out a lot about both teams in that matchup. But for the Ole Miss Rebels, I do think that Ole Miss is a team that, can still get some pieces rolling, can still get some things figured out. Again, they struggled that last game against Tulsa after shutting out Georgia Tech the week prior. So we'll see what Ole Miss can really do when they play at home against Kentucky. Arkansas is here at 18. A very disappointing loss against Texas A&M. They played a really good first quarter, and it all kind of fell downhill from there. So, this is an Arkansas team that has still some things to get figured out, right? KJ Jefferson, I thought could have played better. I thought they could have given more wealth to the wide receivers and things like that. Especially that defense could have clutched up late there as well. And for a struggling Texas A&M offense, they maybe started to find something there. And we'll talk about Texas A&M here in a little bit. But for the Hogs, this is the team that I'm going to get to go see in person next week. I'm going to that game, the Red Out game in Fayetteville against Alabama. And what an environment that is going to be. But for the Arkansas Razorbacks, lot to improve on, lot to take note from this past week against Texas A&M. And I honestly wish Arkansas the best of luck moving forward because I do believe that at their peak, this is a top 10 team. But right now, I have too many questions about this Arkansas team stemming from last week. But I'll have you know, if they can pull off that upset against Bama this week, they're going to be right back in the top 10. So Arkansas is here at number 18. 17 is BYU. Did not move them from last week. They had a good win this past week. So I did not touch BYU. I thought they looked fine, looked good against Wyoming. Again, Wyoming is a lot better of a team than I thought this year. They're going to be a team that's going to compete, and that's going to give some teams like BYU a hard-fought game. Excuse me, guys. I don't know why I'm yawning so much. But for BYU, I just didn't move them from last week. I feel good about where BYU is right now at that number 17 spot. So that's where they are going to stay. BYU, good win last week over Wyoming. Oklahoma, you have their upset loss this week, and they drop 11 spots. I now have some questions about Oklahoma and some of the things that happened in that game. However, I may, and this is a great possibility, I may be overreacting here when I had Oklahoma. Originally, when I made this poll, I had Oklahoma at 19, and I said, no, that's overreacting a little too much, but I could not put them in the top 15 based on all the teams that are above them. And it's not necessarily discredit to Oklahoma's at 16. It's just there are so many teams that are so close. Like Arkansas, BYU, Oklahoma. Like, honestly, you could rearrange any of that. You could rearrange any of that right there. You could throw Ole Miss above them. Like, there are just so many teams that are so tightly close together, and that probably would be like pick'ems on a neutral field. But for the Oklahoma Sooners, this is the team that has got to pick it up because they've struggled with K-State before, and this just feels like last week was the one game for Oklahoma where things just don't go right. And I think a lot of Sooner fans are going to hope that that's the case moving forward because we've seen what this Oklahoma team can be. This is a dynamic offense. The defense is much improved, and it didn't necessarily show last week, but Oklahoma is a team that can push their way for a Big 12 title and can push their way for a spot in the college football playoff. They didn't necessarily show that last week, although they have shown it in weeks prior. So not necessarily worried about Oklahoma up to this point. And again, I could be overreacting dropping them this low to 16. There are just other teams above them in my poll that I felt like deserved to be in the top 15, which is where we go now. And one of those teams is Texas A&M. So Texas A&M is starting to find that groove on offense. It wasn't perfect against Miami, but they found a little something. And by all means, it wasn't perfect against Arkansas. Again, guys, I apologize. But it wasn't perfect against Arkansas. Yet, it's starting to feel like the offense is getting better. The offense is getting better. The defense is playing well for Texas A&M. And I vaulted them into the top 15 after that win against Arkansas. They are now, I vaulted them into the top 15. They jumped 5 spots and are at that 15th spot. For Texas A&M, again, it's a question of getting that offensive consistency, getting that offense to play consistently well week after week after week. And that's going to be the important thing about Texas A&M coming forward. This team is absolutely capable of doing it, and we'll see how good Texas A&M looks here down the stretch because they got another tough game here in a week. They got to play Alabama. Guys, I immensely apologize for my amount of yawning. I'm trying to stop. But Texas A&M's got some tough games coming up. We'll see what the Aggies are really made of in those games. The Oregon Ducks rise 2 spots here to number 14. I've liked the way that Oregon has played so far this year as well. They were able to beat down on BYU a couple weeks ago, and last week Well, it felt like Washington State was going to be one of those other new teams that was going to enter the top 25, or at least one of those teams in consideration, because Oregon proved in that game against BYU, this is a really good football team. Yet Washington State was able to kind of push Oregon around last week and really kind of do whatever they wanted with the Ducks. And Oregon is a team that, well, you can learn a lot from that game. Now, there were a couple late instances in that game which helped Oregon pull out that win. So good for Oregon in finishing out and getting that win. But there is a lot to learn from that Washington State game. Oregon scored late. They picked the ball off, ran the ball back in, and were able to beat Washington State seemingly handily. But if you watch the game, Washington State led for most of that game. So Oregon's got some things to polish, got some things to figure out. But all in all, a great come-from-behind win to pull out that one. So I have Oregon here at number 14. Number 13 is Oklahoma State. They did not play last week, and the only reason they rise is because teams ahead of them drop. That's kind of what happens here. If you don't play last week, I either don't move you or teams that were ahead of you dropped, which was exactly what happened this past weekend. So Oklahoma State is up here to number 13, and I'm starting to like this Oklahoma State team more and more. I'm not ready to put them inside the top 10 quite yet, like a lot of other people are, but I'm starting to come around on the Oklahoma State Cowboys, and they got a big matchup with Baylor coming up this week, so we'll see what transpires there. I got Penn State here at number 12. Penn State, man, this is really starting to look like a team that can push Ohio State to the limit. Ohio State, we'll talk about them a little later. Clearly the front runners in the Big Ten East. And Penn State even looks like they can give Michigan a good run for their money there as well. This is a real contender in the Big Ten East. Take this team seriously. They're really starting to look like it after that beat down against Auburn. They are looking really good. Guys, I don't know what's going on. I sincerely apologize, but I'm going to try to get through this video here. But Penn State looking like a really, really good team, and this should be a real good challenge for Ohio State and Michigan later down the line. Even some games like Michigan State, that's going to be an interesting one to watch there as well. But Penn State, watch out for them. This team is the real deal. NC State is going to be here at number 11, 4-0 on the season. Now, they have had a couple scares so far this season. Texas Tech, although actually NC State was able to handle Texas Tech fairly well. But for NC State, having that scare against East Carolina, and since then, they've looked pretty good. They look pretty good. That defense is starting to come around, starting to play on with their hair on fire. This is an NC State defense that is really, really good, and the offense is coming around there as well. So for the NC State Wolfpack, this is a team that can absolutely go win the ACC. And for the NC State Wolfpack, they got a huge game coming up this week. I believe College Game Day is going to be there. Clemson and NC State. What a massive game that is going to be. And yeah, so we'll kind of see what happens there in that game. I'll be previewing that game later in the week in my weekly predictions video. But for the NC State Wolfpack, they're doing a lot of nice things right now. But they just barely did miss out on my top 10, because when we look at my top 10, I got Baylor here in my top 10. Yes, Baylor does rise to that 10th spot. And again, I think people, especially in the national media, are overreacting to this Baylor team. I really like this Baylor team. I really, really like this Baylor team. I still think this is a physical team. I still think this team can absolutely run the ball. They've had a running back break out for them this year. Blake Shapen is a more than capable quarterback. I think people need to pump the brakes a little bit on Baylor. We're going to find out a lot about both Baylor and Oklahoma State this week when they two face off on the gridiron. I believe that, excuse me, guys, I don't know what's going on. And I do believe that game is in Waco there as well. But for the Baylor Bears, I still think people pump the brakes a little bit on Baylor. We're going to find out what this team is really capable of here over the next couple of weeks. They have some pretty important games coming up, especially this week against Oklahoma State. Kentucky is here at number 9, and they had a little bit of a scare. They did. They had a little bit of a scare against Northern Illinois, but Northern Illinois is a good team out of the Mid-American Conference. They're a team that can go ahead and go win that conference. And Kentucky, at one point, you knew that they were going to win the game. But Northern Illinois did make things interesting late. So Kentucky's got a huge game this weekend with Ole Miss. And I really like the way that Kentucky has played up to this point. I think this is the top 10 team in the nation. Obviously, I have them in my top 10. And I think that that they're definitely going to either solidify that or prove a lot of people wrong this past week. And maybe people see that Ole Miss is better than people thought and that Kentucky still got some ways to go, things like that. But Kentucky, definitely a very good team up to this point. Number 8 is Utah. You guys know my stance on the Utah Utes. They absolutely dominated Arizona State this past week, and Utah is a team that I really like. I think this team plays with a lot of fire, a lot of energy, and I didn't punish them that much for losing that game against Florida, which maybe now people are going to do more so, because especially with how Florida looks right now, but that was just a matchup of two physical teams. Florida had a good game plan for Utah. And this Utah team is still physical, and they have been really good ever since that loss to the Florida Gators. So I am not worried about Utah. They stay in my top 10 here at number 8. But how about the Tennessee Volunteers jumping up 6 spots into the top 10 to number 7? This is a Volunteer team that I'm starting to kind of fall in love with a little bit. And Rocky Top has a lot to be excited about this year because Tennessee is moving. This is a team that's playing some really good football right now offensively. Their defense, yes, while still having some question marks, has improved a lot from years prior. This is a Tennessee team that just feels different this year, right? They feel different. And Tennessee's got some big games coming up here in a couple of weeks. They have to play Alabama. Kentucky is still on the schedule. They still have Georgia down the line. This is the Tennessee team that is going to be very interesting to watch later down the line, as they have some of these more important games. They've already beat Pitt. They've already beat Florida. Tennessee can have a lot more quality wins on their resume if they can go beat teams like Georgia and Alabama, which over the past couple of weeks have looked vulnerable. So we'll see what happens with Tennessee in the SEC. But, man, that's a Tennessee team that can score as many points as it needs. And then that defense, again, still got things to work on, but it's definitely improved from seasons prior. USC is at number 6. They narrowly escaped Oregon State this past week. Caleb Williams just did not play well in that game. And while, frankly, for USC, you love that you came out with a win in that game, because for the longest time it didn't necessarily look like it. USC had to come take the lead late. And Oregon State was just unable to do anything with the football with Chance Nolan at quarterback. So USC, this is the team, can push for a spot in the college football playoff. Definitely, in my opinion, the favorite to go ahead and win that Pac-12 conference, although there are a lot more contenders in there that people may think. Now, of course, you have your Utahs, your Oregons, Washingtons, but how about USC, Oregon State, Washington State? There are a lot of teams in the Pac-12 that can play. Spoiler, USC's got a big matchup with Utah here in a couple of weeks, and we're going to find out a lot about both of those programs. But now entering the top 5. The top 5 goes back to the way it was for the past couple of weeks. Besides last week, of course, I had Oklahoma in there. Clemson rejoins the fray in the top 5, and the top 4 remain unchanged. So Clemson needed overtime to beat Wake, but Clemson found their offense, right? That offense was moving, and that's part of Clemson finding their offense, and also Wake Forest kind of trying to still figure some things out on the defensive side of the ball. But for the Clemson Tigers, this was a very good performance this past week against Wake Forest. Yes, they needed overtime to go ahead and beat Wake, but I think Wake solidified their worth, and Clemson has solidified that this offense is a lot better off than some people give them credit for. So Clemson has vaulted themselves into the top 5, and of course the top 4 have remained unchanged, although there are some talking points with these top 4 teams. Michigan had to pull away from Maryland late, and that was Michigan's first kind of big test this year. So still a top 4 team in my mind. There's no doubt about that. But with Michigan, they started to show some vulnerabilities last week. Again, their non-conference slate was not very threatening at all. They were going to win each of those games by 30 to 40 points. It was just going to happen. Michigan, their offense did not look that dynamic. Now, again, I did not get to watch the game. I did watch highlights, but I did not get to watch the game because, again, I was at the Kansas game, and signal in Lawrence just isn't that great. So didn't get to watch much of the game, but from people I talked to that did watch the game, they said that Michigan could have played a lot better. They definitely could have played a lot better. But how about the performance from Blake Corum? He had like 250 yards, something like that on the ground. I mean, he is dynamite for Michigan this year. He's going to give defenses a hell of a time with whoever they end up playing, especially one team that's also on this slide. But for the Michigan Wolverines, definitely some things to learn from that Maryland game. Still a top 4 team, though, as they have a tricky road game with Iowa coming up this week. Alabama stays here at number 3. Again, the vulnerabilities with this team are their offensive line and their wide receiver group. Those are the two things that Alabama has got to work on and has got to solidify down before some of these bigger games. And they have one of them coming up this week against Arkansas. They still have to play Tennessee and Texas A&M. Bama still got Ole Miss down there on the schedule, LSU, Mississippi State, Auburn. Bama's got a lot of tough games still left on the schedule, and Bama is probably going to end up taking a loss somewhere down the line if they can't get those vulnerabilities figured out. So watch out for Bama. This is definitely a vulnerable team in my eyes, and we'll see what Bama does to fix that this week against Arkansas. Again, I'm going to that game in Fayetteville. That's going to be a lot of fun. Ohio State stays here at number 2, but you can make the case on why Ohio State is the best team in the entire nation. Why? Well, Ohio State looked the part this past weekend against the University of Wisconsin. Ohio State looked like they were ready to take on some of the bigger teams in the nation. That offense is rolling. C.J. Stroud is the second highest QBR, only behind that of Jalen Daniels out of Kansas. But Stroud still has a 95.4 QBR, I believe is the number. He's playing some really good football. Even without Jackson Smith and Jigba, Ohio State is playing really well in the wide receiver group. They got 2 running backs that can ground pound, and they're big, powerful human beings. Ohio State is looking really good, and that defense is even improved. Minus that 75-yard run that Braylon Allen had, Ohio State held the star back to just 4 yards a carry. So for this Ohio State team, there's still a lot to work on, and there's still a lot of things to figure out. But this Ohio State team is looking dangerous already this season. They play Rutgers next week, and then their schedule gets a little tougher when they have to play Michigan State, Iowa, Penn State. Later down the line, they got Maryland and, of course, the game against Michigan. But Georgia does stay at number 1, although Georgia showed a lot of vulnerabilities this past week. They really did struggle with Kent State. Stetson Bennett did not play well. This defense did not play well. And a lot of Georgia fans out there are saying this team deserved to lose that game against Kent State. And Kent State not afraid to play these bigger Power 5 opponents. They had 3 of them on their schedule. They'd already played Washington and they'd already played Oklahoma. Both teams that are in the top 25, and they went and played the number 1 team in the country, and they didn't care that they had that number 1 by their name. Georgia's got a lot to figure out from that past game. And the gap between Georgia and Ohio State for number 1, in my opinion, has closed tremendously. In fact, if you want to go ahead and put Ohio State at number 1, I'm not going to argue with you for a number of reasons, but I won't name those here. Georgia's still the number 1 team. Top 4 remained relatively unchanged. You got Clemson back in the top 5. Let me know what you guys think about the top 25. You can leave yours in the comment section below, and I appreciate you guys so much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, do anything like that to help support the channel. And remember to play hard, but tailgate harder. I'll see all you guys in the next video. Goodbye.